All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Monday, November 29th of 2021. Thank you for tuning in today. Hope you guys all had a great weekend. Was quite a strange NFL DFS slate for sure. I think it looked a little strange going into it. We had obviously the 3 games on Thanksgiving and some teams still on buys, and obviously the primetime game yesterday and tonight. So not a lot of games on the slate, but of the games we got, was particularly ugly. I could tell when my process was leading me to playing a lot of Tyrod Taylor stacks. I knew it was going to be a weird week. So ended up being roughly break even for me, but hope you guys had a profitable NFL Sunday. It is Monday here, so that means we've got a few things to do on stream. We will be, of course, answering your guys' questions. We have a few questions already in our queue for today, but since it is Monday, the first thing we have to do is do our weekly max challenge stuff for this week. So let me go ahead and get this pulled up here first off and talk about what I'm talking about. I know we are now past week 12, so won't explain everything going on here. I've talked about this a lot on other streams, but the short of it is, if you play NFL DFS and max out the 5-cent pooch punt or the 50-cent mini max on FanDuel or DraftKings for the NFL Sunday main slate, use a SaberSim avatar as your profile picture on those sites, and then send us a screenshot of your entries showing your username and that you're wearing the SaberSim avatar. You're eligible to win a bunch of prizes. If you bink the contest, which we actually had last week, we'll send you a ton of stuff, but you're eligible right off the bat for a giveaway to play the contest for free the following week, and the highest scoring person that enters the contest every week will get some extra goodies. So full list of rules here on this page here, but we will go ahead and just get into it. So first things first, announcing our winners for this week. Let's do DraftKings first here. So the highest overall scorer that entered this contest in the DraftKings Minimax for this week, coming in 73rd place, was Seminole FS. Congratulations, Seminole FS. Definitely a familiar name. I know, I believe this person has probably entered most weeks, if not all. So again, that persistence pays off, but Seminole FS will win a ticket to a $50 and $27 single entry contest for next week's slate, or really whenever you want to use them. They don't expire. We'll get you a free month of SaberSim, and you will have a ticket into the private $5,000 free roll we are running on DraftKings at the end of the season. While we are talking about DraftKings, I know I am certainly going to get some questions here about it today. So I'll talk about this now. I'm sure I'll be answering it again here shortly. DraftKings is a little bit behind on getting these tickets out. I know we've gotten a lot of emails and Slack messages and things like that about where people's tickets are. I know definitely a lot of excitement here when you win your tickets and then you're wondering where they are. So first of all, I apologize that it has taken so long to get some of these tickets out. I think we are unfortunately about 2 weeks behind on these with the Thanksgiving holiday here. I think DraftKings just ended up falling really behind on getting these tickets out. So we will be doing another round of winners for today. Obviously, Seminole FS winning some single entry tickets. We'll be doing 3 giveaway winners for Minimax tickets for next week. And then I will email them again, go bug DraftKings to get all 3 weeks of these tickets now out. I know it is a bit frustrating, or at least maybe a little bit disappointing when you win the giveaway or you have the high scoring week and then the tickets aren't there. So we are working to get these out as quickly as possible. I will go be annoying to DraftKings again here in their email box as soon as I hop off. But anyway, just wanted to provide a quick status update there. So it is something we're aware of. You are going to get your tickets, I promise. But anyway, let's keep it rolling here. So Seminole FS, again, our winner for the DraftKings side. On the FanDuel side, coming in 5th overall, a pretty impressive score on that FanDuel contest, especially because I think it's like 500,000 something entries, was JB Adams Jr. So JB Adams Jr., 5th overall in the FanDuel contest. Congratulations. We will be getting you a $25 SaberSim credit, a free month of SaberSim, and an entry into the private $1,000 free roll on FanDuel that we are running at the end of the season. So congratulations, JB Adams Jr. A good overall showing from the SaberSim crew in the pooch punt this week. Ross let me know that we actually had 8 overall SaberSim avatars showing up in the top 44 on the FanDuel pooch punt. So definitely a lot of people showing up and repping SaberSim in the pooch punt, and a lot of people that came pretty close to that top score overall this week. I think I was actually sneaking around in there as well. Been playing that contest and been doing pretty well in that in the last couple weeks. But anyway, that is it for our highest scorers for this week. Again, let's go ahead and jump over and do our giveaway. So 3 giveaway winners for this week on DraftKings for free mini-max tickets for next week. Or I think they're actually just being processed. It's like 50-cent tickets that you can use elsewhere. I'm not positive on that, but I know they're not expiring on a week-to-week basis. So anyway, for 150 mini-max tickets here, let's go ahead and get our entrance in for this week. I have 53 on the DraftKings side this week. So let me grab these here. And our trusty wheel of names, our first winner for this week here on the DraftKings side. Is Enlow Jr. Definitely some familiar names here starting to show up, which is awesome. That's actually what we really wanted out of this entire contest, right? We wanted to build a contest around the kind of persistence you need to be successful at DFS, showing up every week, going through your process that you know works, and ultimately over the long term realize your expected value. So I do think it's kind of cool that we are seeing the people that have entered here every single week and stayed with this, reaping some of the benefits, even if not necessarily on the DFS side week to week, reaping some of the benefits on the contest. So congratulations, Enlow Jr., a familiar name there. I know that has at least one other time here. So our second winner on the DraftKings side this week is Kev Collin, who I actually think we owe tickets to, who actually I think won last week. So we will make sure we get both sets of those tickets out to you. And again, you have my apologies that there have been delays here. And our third winner for this week on the DraftKings side, oh, wow. We haven't had one of these yet so far this season. This is actually the first time this has happened. Seminole FS takes down the giveaway as well. So quite a haul for Seminole FS, the $50 single entry ticket, the $27 single entry ticket, and you play the mini-max for free next week. Congratulations. That is quite a haul. I'll go ahead and grab our 3 winners here and copy these down so we've got a record of this here. Get an email out to you guys before the end of the day so everybody knows that they won. And we'll go ahead and we'll jump over to FanDuel. For FanDuel, I've got 56 entrants. We're going to be pulling the lever 10 times here, and we are playing for $7.50 in SaberSim credit. I know we were not able to get a situation set up with FanDuel for this season to award tickets, hoping to do that for future contests that we have going with FanDuel. Through the end of the season, we'll be awarding all the prizes as SaberSim credit. So on the FanDuel side, for $7.50 of SaberSim credit, which approximately pays for next week's Pooch Punt entries anyway, let's get into it. First winner is SportsFan14. Congratulations, sports fan here. Let me actually, that's fine. That'll work. Winner number 2 here. Cody said rigged, I assume, about the Seminole FS double win. I assure you it is not rigged. Dicehawk is our second winner here. Congratulations, Dicehawk. We have had definitely some questions about the fact that this is loaded in alphabetical order before. I assure you it does not make a difference ultimately when we are randomizing the list. But anyway, number 3 here. I think last week we had 3 winners that just so happened to be drawn in alphabetical order, and I think that maybe raised a couple questions. But it's a random draw. Big PLC here is our third winner on the FanDuel side. Ogden 330302. Congratulations. Cleansinger here. Congratulations on your free ticket. Well, I should stop saying free tickets. $7.50 in SaberSim credit. Oh, just missed you, Cody. El Frio? El Frio? Definitely. It looks like a new name here. Might be mispronouncing that. If you end up watching this El Frio, let me know the proper pronunciation there. I messed myself up because I forgot to clear the list after the first three. So what do we have? We have 6 here so far. We got 4 more spins. Miami Mike here is our 7th winner. Our 8th winner on the FanDuel side, Big Wig 500. Congratulations, Big Wig. And 2 more for this week. Week 12. Can you believe it? Is going quick. Gerard 42. I think our overall winner on the FanDuel side last week, if I can remember correctly, or one of these weeks recently. So congratulations for that Gerard. And then last spin on the FanDuel side for this week here. Is right on the edge, and it's Rum Runners. Takes it down. So our 10 winners on the FanDuel side here. Make sure we just got 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yep, we're all good there. I'll make sure I get an email out to all of you guys before the end of the day. We'll get those credits applied. Congratulations again to all of our winners. And for the people that have just recently joined up here, I do see a few other people have joined the stream. I know we are still waiting to get DraftKings tickets out, so I will be bugging DraftKings again here today. We have 2 rounds of winners that still need their tickets paid out, and then, of course, all of the winners from today. We'll go ahead and get those all out to DraftKings. I think the Thanksgiving Day holiday just kind of screwed everything up. Got things falling behind, but I know people are very excited to get those tickets out. I apologize for the delays there. I know it's really exciting when you win the giveaway or you have the highest score and then you're not getting your tickets. So working on getting those out here all this week so that we can get nice and caught up. But for now, that will do it for our weekly max challenge. We'll be right back at this again on week 13 here, looking ahead to next week. So keep it up here. And in the meantime, we'll go ahead and start jumping into some questions here. So first of all, if this is your first time watching the stream here, this is open Q&A. I get questions in through YouTube chat, through the Office Hours channel in Slack, through email, support@sabersim.com, and we'll talk about these things live on stream. So I do the show live for a reason. If you have questions about whatever I'm talking about, please follow up. Ask clarifying questions, ask follow-up questions. That is the whole point of this. I want to make sure people have a good sense of having felt like their question really got answered there. So without much further ado, we'll go ahead and start diving in. I'm going to tackle questions in roughly the chronological order they came in, starting with here a few questions that came in here earlier this morning. So I'm going to start here. This is a question from Kobe. And he says, how accurate are the ownership projections? This is a good question. Definitely, comes up fairly often. I'll tell you what we'll do here is I'll talk about the way our ownership projections are calculated, a few improvements we made this past season to making them a little bit better, but also some limitations or some things that maybe our ownership projections will not be as sharp with. So the way our ownership projections are calculated is we take a industry aggregate projection for each player, And then we build thousands of lineups at a variance setting, and for a sport like NFL, sometimes a little bit of correlation to kind of mimic the lineups that we think the field might build for the contest, given the way that the field thinks about the slate using an aggregate projection. And the exposures, right? The how often a player shows up in that pool of thousands of lineups become the ownership projections for that particular contest. And why this can be very valuable, and a few things that are pretty cool about this, is that the ownership projections are actually determined by building actual lineups, right? There are often players that are projected well, or there are players that are getting, touted and are showing up very highly in a lot of like core plays and things like that. And people can generally identify that those are going to be popular plays. But when you actually sit down to start building lineups because of correlations or positional eligibility or salary, right? There are sometimes certain players that just fit. If all the value on a NFL slate is at running back, right? The wide receivers are going to be chalkier, even if they don't project that much better. Like the high dollar wide receivers are going to be a little bit chalkier, even if they don't project all that well, because that's where you have to spend up, just for example. If you are projecting ownership in a way that isn't building lineups, that you're not building lineups to project that ownership, or at least considering this, you can miss that kind of thing. So I do think the ownership projections can be pretty sharp there, because they are determined by building lineups, right? It is a purely computer-driven approach. We're not going in there and setting these. Another thing that I think is really useful about the ownership projections is we project ownership for every single slate that you can find. Every single NBA slate, the turbos, the night slates, every single showdown, right? Even in baseball, all kinds of different things. If we project the projections for the players, we generally have ownership. And one challenging thing, if you're playing the early only slate in NFL, sometimes you can find early only ownership projections out there, but they may not update as quickly with news. Or if you're using main slate projections, sometimes it can be hard to know how do those transfer over to early only projections. We have all that stuff ready to go. So can be really powerful there. In terms of where there are some limitations, because there are some limitations here, where are our ownership projections likely to go wrong? There's a couple things. First of all, because it is like a computer, well, first, let me say this. We are projecting these ownership projections for a large field, I would say generally like medium stakes GPP, right? If you are playing smaller field contests or single entry, you are going to find that our ownership projections are probably going to under project the best place, right? Ownership tends to condense on smaller fields. So that's one thing to look for. But even beyond that, because it is a computer algorithm basically that is coming up with these ownership projections, it can miss certain things. It can miss narratives. It can miss, if there's a certain particular player that is going to be chalky. A good example is last night, I think LeBron James and Isaiah Stewart. Actually, I know last night was not probably a very popular slate with football going on and stuff. But there was definitely a little bit of narrative going around about LeBron James and Isaiah Stewart playing each other again. And I think in that game's showdown and also in the main slate last night, those guys, especially maybe at a little bit of lower stakes, got a little chalkier than one might have expected. But other narratives that are leading towards a player to being more highly owned that are going to show up in the projections, we can miss. We will also sometimes over-project certain players for ownership that the builder is finding easy to play in lineups that, the field may not see as easily. And one thing, you can typically find these, a lot of times they are value plays without kind of a clear, trying to think about the word, a clear narrative reason for why they are popping up as value, right? So I haven't studied the slate too much here, but a decent example might be a guy. There are typically guys on the NBA side, like low salary guys that just look a little bit underpriced that end up popping a lot in the projections. And maybe an example is Nasir Little. Again, I'm not positive anybody's out for Portland, but I don't believe so. Oh, Norman Powell's out. So maybe it's a pricing issue. Let me see if I can find another one here. What's going on with Houston? Is Jalen Green's still out. There may not be a great example here for tonight's slate. But you will see sometimes you've got these players that really aren't filling a spot. There isn't somebody that's injured on the team that is really just kind of maybe a little bit underpriced. When the builder builds thousands of lineups, it finds it very easy to use that player in the lineups, and it will overproject that player's ownership. And I think that player ends up coming in a lot lower owned than expected. That's one thing to look for. Another thing to look for is recency bias, especially as you get to lower stakes. Softer players are just going to be much more swayed by recent performance in general. I think we have been underprojecting. We were underprojecting Anthony Edwards on pretty much every slate until he recently had like that dud game where it kind of fell off. But he had that 70 DraftKings points outing and then followed that up with a couple other good performances and was consistently coming in at like 40% ownership in things like the quarter jukebox and the and one and some of the lower stakes DraftKings contests, even though we were projecting him for around 22 points, right? That's another good example of where humans are going to do something biased, very human-like. And when you ask a computer to approximate that behavior, they're not going to be able to really know exactly what that bias might look like. So overall, kind of summing up this question, I think the ownership projections are very good, and I think there are advantages to the fact that it is really like a data-driven approach to projecting ownership. But a very sharp thing I would say that you can add to your process that isn't too time consuming is when you sit down to build your lineups for the slate, sit down and look at the highest projected owned players. And if you see anyone that seems a little bit out of line, or vice versa, if you see somebody that is missing, take it upon yourself to make those adjustments. I would feel comfortable adding value in that way. That's something that I do pretty frequently here. And you do not need to worry about dialing in your projections, your ownership projections, I think, down to, even the nearest 0.1 decimal place or anything like that. That is absurd. We don't even really have that kind of precision here really in projecting ownership. So, if you're looking at the slate and you think that Joel Embiid's ownership projection looks low, then bump it. And don't sweat too much about where you bump it to or being absolutely precise. Just giving this a bump in general will allow that ownership fade slider to be a little bit more precise with the way that it works when it's building your lineups and improve the quality of your lineups overall. So, but it can also be a good cause for researching a certain team and maybe finding somebody that you weren't otherwise on. So, but good question. Okay, cool. Michael has a question here from Slack, and he said, if we have a lineup build already made, say 150 with a 50 or a 500 pool, when we refresh for updated projections, does that build re-rank the existing lineup in the pool with the new projection? If so, does it stay locked on the original lineup ranks if we have assigned them to entries already? Okay, it isn't totally apparent when and what exactly gets re-ranked or updated within existing builds on a projection refresh. Okay, cool. This is a really good question. So let's actually step through this here. I'm going to start by just pulling in. I think I have a few contests entered for tonight here because I want to have this. Oh, yeah. Okay, I've at least got a couple entries here. Okay. So how does this work, right? So let's go ahead and talk about this. So if we build some lineups for tonight's slate, and we'll get this build going here. Okay, so we've got our builds here, and maybe we've spent a little bit of time on this here. And the question is basically, when news breaks, well, first of all, let me say this first. If significant news breaks in NBA, like a player is ruled out or something like that, or a starting lineup is a lot different than we expected, I always recommend, instead of just going back here and clicking the refresh button, to start with a fresh build. Because what Michael says here is correct. When you just go back here and you click this refresh button, all we're doing is we're taking the original pool of 500 lineups and resorting them based on what the best ones are now that the projections have changed. But we're not rebuilding lineups. So for example, let's say Jokic gets ruled out right before lock, right? Better than going in here and resorting the lineups would be rebuilding the lineups, because obviously not only do we want Jokic out of the lineups, but we want probably exposure to a bunch of other different Nuggets players now that Jokic is out, because that value has opened up. So what happens is that we will resort your lineups by the new projections when you click this icon, but it is always best to start with a brand new build instead, so that you can build a brand new full pool with up-to-date lineups. But if we go ahead here and let's do something to this to kind of make it our own so that we can save this here, right? So let's say we've got 20 lineups and we save them and we're good to go. And then we go into the entry editor, right? And then we fill. And good time for me to go ahead and just get some lineups into DK anyway here. Okay, so we've entered our lineups to DK, I think. Yep. And now we go back and refresh this, right? So now let's say that projections have changed. And let's say, just for example, let's say Jokic has gotten ruled out or something like that. So let's just say that the projections have changed. And we came back here and we did this, right? And the projections have changed. That does not affect what is in the entry editor. So what the lineups have become resorted, right? We have a new set of lineups that have been resorted here. But you can actually see, if we go back to the entry editor, that, let's see, these are going to, okay. So yeah, so you can see here, right? So our projection for Jokic has changed to 0, right? But he's still in these lineups that are in the entry editor. So this does not happen necessarily completely automatically. So now the proper step would be to go back and refill with the new lineups, the most recent one we made, which are at the 12:25:51 p.m. lineups, right? Rank fill them, and now Jokic is removed, right? So by default, the lineups that we originally built here are the ones that are still showing up, which were the Jokic lineups, right? So if you go back to this build, you can see loading lineups, and we can refresh this, and it'll refresh projections and resort things, and it'll create a new lineup set. But it will not automatically update the lineups that are in your entry editor. So kind of a very important thing to note there. If you're really short on time, if news breaks right before lock and you're not going to have time to run a brand new build and redo everything, I think it can be good enough to go in here, refresh, save as, and then you go back to the entry editor and re-update there. So we'll never kind of pull the rug out from under you using the entry editor. That's just kind of an important rule of thumb here. Your lineups in general that are here, that are kind of primed for entry in the entry editor, will always be the last time you went in and actually filled them with something. So, but a good question there. And Michael, let me know if that helps clarify there. But okay, cool. We'll keep it going here. And let me go ahead and get to some of these questions that came in before the start of the stream in the YouTube chat. So Don said, when late swapping in NFL, do you tinker with exposure percent, or do you let SaberSim do all the work? Also, does SaberSim account for actual scores when late swapping? So that second question, the answer is no at the moment. That's something that we are hopefully planning on adding in a future update. The ability to pull in we have the ability to pull in the actual scores, but to allow you to dynamically late swap based on that, right? Maybe you have low performing lineups that you want to swap more aggressively. You want to use higher variance. You want to use higher ownership fade. Maybe you have lineups that are performing really well and you want to get them more chalky, right? You just want to play the best plays. Maybe you want to block if you're at the very top of the standings, right? If maybe you're in first after the early games in NFL and you have one wide receiver left, it can make a lot of sense to just swap into the best overall projected receiver and try to block people below you from jumping you with that highest projected overall player. But for the question of, do I tinker with exposure percent or let SaberSim do all the work? I like to stay, I would say I'm somewhere in between those two, right? I think the easiest thing to do overall when you're late swapping in NFL is to just do like a practice one to start with. right? So we can't, the most unfortunate thing about this particular timing here on stream, especially with NFL questions, is I can't ever actually show any of this stuff like totally live because we don't have a late swap slate to show. But what I like to do is I like to like, especially if significant news has broke, is I will run one late swap and not even necessarily enter it, but just see what's coming out and look if there's any outliers. Is there anybody that's popping in terms of exposure that is way higher than they were when I built my lineups before? And then pick a couple target players that maybe I want to bring down exposure to, right? But typically when there is big news, something significant, I keep going back to the week where Dalvin Cook was hurt, questionable headed into lock, and then ruled out after the slate locked, right? After late swapping, I had something like 90 to 95, 100% Madison, and I was totally fine with that. But I don't think you need to worry about setting a bunch of exposures. We can use the NBA, I guess, as an example for now, right? Let's say it's after lock and we're late swapping, right? And some news has broken. We're trying to determine what we want to do to our lineups. I think an easy way of figuring out if you should set any exposure settings or do anything like that is to just run a test build, run a test late swap really, and see what you're getting. To see if there's any players that maybe you have too much exposure to, more than you're comfortable with, whatever the answer is there, right? But for me, I would say on average, most of the time, I don't really touch exposures when late swapping in general. The field doesn't do it enough. And if there is a spectacular value play that has opened up in the late games, I generally want to get as much of them as I can anyway. There's so many players that have already, so much salary is already tied up in those lineups. So many positional spots have already been used that a lot of times you can't even get as much exposure to those best projected plays as you would like anyway. And at that point, I'm not concerned about trying to cap exposure to manage risk or anything like that. If we do let's go look who's questionable. I know Jokic. I guess this Denver-Miami game is where a lot of these questionable players are tonight. Zach LaVine's, I guess, a good one, right? Yeah, Zach LaVine's a good one. Yeah, because he's playing at the 6 o'clock game. So let's say we get, I don't know if Zach LaVine's really legitimately questionable, but let's say we get the Zach LaVine news, right before this 6 o'clock Mountain Time game. You've already used up some of the salary in the 5:30 and 5 o'clock game. Depending on who ends up being ruled out in this game, you might end up using a lot of it. And all of a sudden, you have an opportunity to get these new value plays. DeRozan, Vucevic will all project well, but also guys like Caruso and Kobe White and probably Javonte Green are all going to pop now because LaVine is out, right? I'm not so concerned with trying to say, I only want 60% of Kobe White now, because you may only even if you maximally used him, you may only have 40% of lineups that can even roster him now. So I'm generally pretty unconcerned with exposures when late swapping, me personally. But I think if you want to just check, especially if you have time, just do one swap and just see what comes out. And if there's players that look a little high or look like that's too much exposure for you, go back, then set the max exposure and do it again. I think that's probably the easiest approach there overall. In terms of my more leverage, more strategy focused exposures, right? I'll sometimes, especially in a sport like NFL and particularly in baseball, I will set min and max exposures to intentionally get over and under the field to find leverage on the field. Less so about, managing risk, but more so about trying to be optimally leveraged against the plays that I think are over and under owned. For football, I will leave a lot of those intact when late swapping if I have the feeling that the slate hasn't changed much with the afternoon inactives. But if the slate has changed significantly, a lot of times I will reset most of those and count on the idea that I'm getting most of my edge now on that slate from the rest of the field inefficiently late swapping to that news. It's kind of the way I like to think about it. So, but Matt said, on the note of late swap, SaberSim Classic used to show how many lineup changes when doing late swap. Is that possible in the new app to see what updated or forthcoming update? Yeah, that was a bit of an oversight with the redesign here, and ended up just not showing up in our redesign. It's something that we are planning on adding back in along with the update that I was talking about before that will allow you to kind of late swap selectively based on current actual score and things like that. There's kind of an overall update to both the entry editor and the late swap tool going on behind the scenes right now, and includes a bunch of those kinds of things in it. So the ability to see what changed is coming back. So all right, cool. Let's see. Question from Young Stunna here. I'm having trouble with exposure once I change and try to match the field or go over or under on like 2 or 3 players. SaberSim's giving me the message that it has to add players to the lineup. So that generally shouldn't show up with just a couple exposures set. What this question is referring to here, I'll show it first just so we can see it, is if you go and set a bunch of exposures. So a very easy way to just get this thing to show up is to, let's do like this. We'll say 200 lineups, and we can just go ahead and start Xing some of these guys out, and we'll see the message here. There it is, pretty quick. We need to expand the lineup pool in order to match your exposures, continue building, right? So what that means basically is that of the exposure settings that you've given us, we don't have enough lineups in the pool to give you the number you're asking for. That should, in general, not show up unless you are making a lot of different changes. So a little interesting that you say it's coming up here after you've just adjusted 2 or 3 players. I would say if you're having issues with this, overall, there's a few things I can recommend. The first is to go back to step 1 and make sure that you haven't accidentally locked or removed any players or anything like that. That can, or if you've intentionally locked or removed, consider relaxing some of that. That can put quite a bit of strain on the lineups that the builder can create. In step 2, build with a larger pool size. This pool size will go up to 1,500, right? If you only need 20 lineups and you're finding that you're running into that message a lot, building 1,500 instead of 500 will give you a lot more lineups to work with. You can also turn up the sim variance slider, which is going to increase the diversity of your lineups quite a bit. And then when we build this here, for the average build, assuming you haven't made a bunch of adjustments to your player pool or anything like that, you should end up with a very, very diverse, fairly flexible pool of NBA lineups to work with, especially if you're only making adjustments to like 2 or 3 players. But we'll let this build here and take a look. But the last note on this too. Oh, did Bamba just get ruled out? Kind of looks like it. Wendell Carter all of a sudden is popping. Oh, no, he's still projected. Interesting. Maybe I don't know. We'll see what happens there. But in general, at this point, this should be pretty flexible, even if you're like doing things like Xing out the players that the builder wants to use the most, right? Like you can see, have quite a bit of flexibility here. So if you are still running into problems, I would email us, support@sabersim.com. Without seeing the actual build itself, it's difficult for me to know exactly what might be causing that error to show up. There's other reasons it can kind of pop up, other things done to the player pool or the exposures that maybe are going overlooked. So, but in general, for the answer to the general question here, I'm running into this issue where I'm seeing the exposure message a lot. Best advice I can give is build a bigger pool and increase your sim variance slider. So on this note here, I'll pick up this question from Jeff. He said, what's the advantage/disadvantage to building a larger pool, like 1,500 instead of 500? Sorry if that's a newbie question. No, it is all good. Not so much of a newbie question here. Let's see. So I guess, advantages and disadvantages. The main thing is that, I would say for probably most builds that are for 20 lineups or less, you just straight up don't really need 1,500 lineups, right? most of the best lineups that we can build for that contest by default, or at least like your top 20 lineups, are likely to be built in that initial pool of 500 anyway. And if you're not making a ton of changes to exposure, you probably don't need a full pool of 1500 from which to sort. 1500 also takes longer to build than 500. It's not a significantly longer build, but it does take longer. So for, I would say, the average build of 20 lineups or less, 500 generally just kind of does the trick. If you need extra lineups because you are doing a lot of exposure changes or things like that, and you are finding that you are hitting that message pretty often, I think it can make a lot of sense to expand that to 1500. If you are building lineups for a 150 max, I would always recommend bumping this up to 1500. In fact, we actually have a to-do on our list here that probably will end up happening this week to just increase the default pool size for 150 max contest to 1500. I think 500 is a little thin for 150 max builds. And if you're building 150 lineups, you'll actually probably find that you see that exposure message quite a bit quicker with just a pool of 500 lineups. So I think for 150, it makes a lot more sense to just bump this to 1500. But in general, you know, the benefits to the smaller pool size are that it's faster and that you just frankly don't need that many lineups most of the time if you're building 20 or less. The advantage to having a larger pool size is that it is a little bit, it will give you, it has a, you know, I guess a little bit of a better chance overall of building the best overall lineups. It is much more flexible to exposure changes in step 3, but it takes a little bit longer. That's basically it. So. Okay, cool. I'm going to hop back here to other questions that were coming in Slack here. Daniel says, on FanDuel, how can I keep from getting 2 point guards from the same team? Common question here. And the short answer here is that there's not really actually a very easy way to do that because we don't have player groups. The reason we don't have player groups, and I'll start here, I'm going to start kind of all the way from the beginning on this question, is because we handle, the main reason why you would want player groups in the first place is for dealing with the problem of correlation, right? The reason we don't use player groups is because we can because we've simulated out every single game on the slate. We can tell exactly which players are positively and negatively correlated to other players and by how much. So we can look at a situation like, let's see, Jalen Suggs and RJ Hampton and see that they do indeed have a very slight negative correlation, but it is almost a neutral correlation, right? And for NBA in particular, I think a lot of these correlations in general end up being a little bit overstated, and that player groups in general kind of do a poor job of actually dealing with this problem of correlation, right? They assume that basically that there are binary correlations. A player can either be positively or negatively correlated to any other player on the court. Positive correlations should be jammed together and negative correlations should be avoided at all costs. And in reality, all these correlations in NBA are pretty soft, right? The most in general positive or negative correlation you're going to see from a certain player is like probably plus or minus 0.1. And even our factors of correlation for a given slate are always going to be pretty low. So with all that said, when you build lineups on SaberSim, you are going to get probably combinations of players that appear by conventional wisdom to be somewhat negatively correlated. But those correlations are low, and the combination of those players showing up in that lineup, the raw upside or the ownership or otherwise whatever reason those players are showing up in the lineup outweighs that negative correlation. So let me see if we can find one here. I guess here's a good example, right? Right off the bat, Brogdon and LeVert, right? I'm sure that these guys are very slightly negatively correlated. Oh, they're actually even, okay, they actually have a fairly significant negative correlation. Well, I wouldn't even say significant, but they have the biggest negative correlation. LeVert's biggest negative correlation on the basketball court tonight is with Brogdon, right? But because of a pricing inefficiency on basically both players, and who are they playing? Playing against a poor defensive team, right? They're showing up in the same lineup here. So anyway, all that to say, we don't have player groups, and that's kind of why we don't. If you still don't want to include those certain combinations of players together, what I would recommend doing is using our filters tool. So you can filter here and say, show me all lineups that have LeVert and Brogdon, and unchecking these lineups from your pool. So we can uncheck all of them. Fill back to 20, clear the filters. And then we should be able to go without having any of those lineups of those two players together. Sometimes it will fill, right? So there are a lot of lineups in the pool. So it's backfilling lineups that also include those players. So you have to kind of iterate here. And I know this can be a bit of a tedious process, but that is the easiest way to do it at the moment. We do have some plans here to make this a little bit easier in the future and do things like just say Karis LeVert and Brogdon, and immediately just say eliminate all lineups from my lineups and pool that have these two players together. I don't want to play them together ever, right? We do have we want to add something in step 3 that can do that, but we are never going to be adding player groups to the app. I can say that in terms of don't group these two players together in any lineups before the build. We explored the idea of doing that, and I think that's actually a mistake in the DFS space of thinking about correlations the wrong way, right? Correlations are on a spectrum. There are two players that are negatively correlated. There's a lot of difference whether you're talking about correlations that is a negative 0.05 and a negative 0.40 correlation, right? And in NBA in particular, I think all of these correlations are completely overstated, right? The pure value, the pure price per dollar value of a player, the player's ownership, as well as that player's upside or that game environment's upside, all have a way bigger impact on whether or not it makes sense to use certain players in the lineup. And when you are seeing players that are like maybe negatively correlated together, like LeVert and Brogdon showing up in the same lineup, or even in this case, right, Giddey and Dort probably are similarly negatively correlated, right? A lot of times players that kind of play a similar position, right? These are very, very minor effects. So I hate to answer these questions where somebody is asking how to do something and my answer is predominantly don't do it at. But in this one in particular, like I really feel strongly about this, that, you know, the easiest way to do this in step 3 is to use the filters and kind of cherry pick lineups that out of your pool that have these combinations of players if you truly don't want them. But I really don't think you need to do that. So it's the same. The flip side of this question that comes up on NFL all the time is, you know, how can I make sure every single lineup has a mini stack outside of my main stack, right? And we have a tool in the NFL side. We actually have a tool that can do that. We have an advanced stacking tool. So if you want to stack along with a QB +2 with one run back in all your lineups, you want to have 2 other players playing in the same game in the lineup, you can set a rule to do that if you want to. But that's another similar question where those correlations are actually pretty small, right? Receiver to opposite side receiver is generally a positive correlation of like 0.1. And you don't necessarily always need to force that in, right? So. But anyway, I'll get off my high horse with that particular question here, and we will keep it rolling. Scott here has a question in Slack as well. And he said, I'm sure I'm just missing it, but I can't save my lineups using the save tab in SaberSim. It's always a dead button. I have to download, save to desktop, then upload. The extra step has caused me to miss a few late stops due to last minute sims. That's no good. I'm sorry to hear that, Scott. I would say one thing to check on is that this, and I know this is a little bit confusing, so I hope to make this a little bit better, but you know, you can see like, okay, here's a perfect example, right? The save button's dead at the moment, right? There's nothing, you can't click save. There is kind of an auto save functionality that happens here, right? And that's to prevent somebody from accidentally leaving without clicking save and losing all of their work. So it should, in general, let's do a quick test. what is supposed to happen is if we make adjustments here, right? Let's see if we can make some adjustments. And then if we just leave, and then we come back, let's see. Okay. So we made 2 adjustments. We put 2 players custom exposure to 60, right? And now we leave and come back and the save button's dead, right? That's because we auto-saved it here at 12:49 my time to save that most recent work. So we didn't lose it. And the autosave should, in general, if you've spent hours dialing in your exposures, I would highly recommend just looking and clicking save if it's enabled. But the autosave generally fires when you leave and come back. Long story short, I would check to make sure if you're seeing a save button that is dead, that you can't click, just see if we've actually already saved the lineup set. We probably have. That's what generally has happened here. And this actually will autosave even without leaving the tab. It will autosave, I don't know how often. I don't know what the time variable is there, but there's kind of an autosave that's built into the app to make sure you don't lose work in the event that something happens. So if you've done some things and save button's not working, it's probably likely that it's already saved here as a lineup set. If we make another change, maybe we just say, I'm not playing Paul George tonight. Now the save button becomes enabled again, right? We're picking up the lineups have changed from the last time we saved them. Now we can click save. And now it's disabled again. So hopefully that helps. If not, if you're still running into issues and that's not exactly what you're running into, Scott, I would email us, support@sabersim.com. Seems kind of more like a support issue, might be a bug you're running into, but that's the best advice I can give if you're running into an issue where the save button's not enabled. Your lineups probably already actually have saved. So. Okay, cool. So good question here from Sean. And this has come up a lot lately. Question about percentiles. I've talked about this a lot on recent streams, but we'll talk about it again here. He says, can you touch on percentile tool? What are the circumstances in which you'd up it to 85th, 95th, et cetera? How do you use it in your process? I'll start here. I pretty much don't use it almost ever. The reason why, for me personally, or at least the way I think through it, is that, the best thing that this is going to do for you is kind of theoretically increase your upside a bit. But because of the way sim variance works, because of the way the sim variance slider works, you are already getting players, right? With percentiles, you're basically looking at a ceiling outcome. You're looking at a set of players' outcomes, that all of their ceilings, and then basically saying, what are the best lineups when all of these players hit a certain percentile outcome? And while that's fine, and that might be a decent tool to use on a optimizer where your only choice was to optimize by ceiling projection, right? When your sim variance is at like 6 or something like that, we are going through and randomly sampling the player's game simulations and then pulling out game sims, pulling out real ranges of outcomes from their entire outcome curve and optimizing lineups around that. So you can kind of know, if you're getting this lineup and you're getting Wood and Keldon Johnson and Karl Anthony Towns, that you got a certain particular set of game sims where those players had those upside outcomes, right? I don't need to change the percentile to see that. So I don't use it very often, especially in NBA. I am extremely unlikely to use it because players are fairly normally distributed across the entire range of their outcomes. And you actually aren't going to get that much difference with looking at an 85th percentile outcome versus a average outcome. I do think it gets a lot more interesting, and it's still not something I use a ton, but it certainly gets a lot more interesting the less normally distributed players are on their range of outcomes, right? So let's go back and look at the main slate here for this week on FanDuel. And when you start thinking about like wide receivers in football, tight ends, running backs to a lesser extent, hitters in baseball, skaters in hockey, you start to get to these players where ranges of outcomes really don't look as normally distributed. I really want to look at a wide receiver, right? And what that ultimately means is that a player's 85th or 95th percentile outcome is cannot be predicted as easily from their average outcome, right? or put another way, kind of reversing that, the average outcome is not, the average projection is not indicative of which players have the highest ceilings and which players get to those ceilings the most often. For sports where you have higher variance sports where players are less normally distributed, I do think it is an interesting idea to turn up the percentiles. And the effect that you are probably going to have from doing that is you are going to have lineups that are probably a little bit higher upside, probably naturally a little bit lower owned, but also may have a lower average expectation, maybe lower projected on the average. There is this effect of, I've seen it over and over again in a bunch of different sports where when you have these high variance players that aren't normally distributed, players can start to condense at the ceiling, right? Let's actually, I want to look at this and go back real quick. So I've actually talked about this at length for hitting stacks, but we can do it here for wide receivers as well. So let's look at this. So our best overall point per dollar projected wide receiver on FanDuel yesterday was Keenan Allen. And he was projected at 2.12 points per dollar. And was, let's go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Point per dollar was projected 2.12 divided by 1.81. Oops. 2.12 divided by 1.81 was approximately a 17% better play. Keenan Allen was a 17% better play using point per dollar as our tool than the 10th best overall projected wide receiver, which was Jamar Chase on FanDuel, right? So it stands to reason that if you're optimizing for average projection, you're going to get more Keenan Allen than Jamar Chase. But if we look at what happens at their 95th percentile outcome, right? Jamar Chase is actually just flat out a better play at the 95th, right? So I didn't even need to calculate the percentage here. And Keenan Allen was kind of like the chalky receiver yesterday. I know he was showing up in a lot of cash builds along with some of these other guys, but he was probably one of the most easy to play cash receivers at on FanDuel, right? But you can see that he's really, you know, all of these receivers here at the highest projected dollar amount are basically all projected for around the same 95th percentile outcome. So when you come over here and you flip this percentile to 95th, what are all those great plays at the average projection are now going to really probably spread out a bunch, because those 95th percentiles are way closer to one another, right? So we still get a lot of Allen actually in this particular case. But we're probably getting a little bit more Chase than we were before. So that's kind of the effect that you have. I don't think it's a must to use it. I think I've been, to be completely honest, I've been talking about it so much here recently on stream that I'm now becoming a little bit more interested in at least just experimenting with it and seeing what I can pull out of it. I think it is best used. I think if you're probably going to use it, it's probably best used in higher variance sports where players are less normally distributed. So I don't know what you're going to get out of it for basketball necessarily too much. I think for football and baseball and hockey, it can be really interesting. I know the one other way I like to use it, and Chris, I do see your question. I promise I will get to it here before the end of the stream. The one other thing that I like to use it for is, and this is way more on the intuitive side, is I like to set the percentile to something where the projected score resembles what I need to beat that contest, right? So let's say, for example, I was playing FanDuel yesterday, and I actually think this is really high. Maybe you're playing like the milli or something like that, and you know that you're going to need like a score of 230. Some of these are really high, but approximately this. You can kind of start to then intuitively have a sense of what you are asking each player to do, and then determine if you want to actually roster those players, right? So, there's a variety of ways to go about this, but maybe this is a good example, right? Like, I'm getting Jeff Swaim showing up in 25% of my lineups. He has a 13-point projection at his 95th percentile outcome. And for a lineup that he is in to be successful and like score the point, I'm like asking him to score 13 points. That seems a little like high to me, right? I don't want to roster him, and I can remove him here. Or maybe Kenny Galladay is a good one, right? Actually, all these Giants receivers, right? Do I believe in this? Do I intuitively believe in this 95th percentile overall projection? And there's a lot of people out there that I think have a very intuitive sense just looking at projections. Hey, this looks a little high. This looks a little low. I don't have that. If you watch my streams a lot, I do everything from exposures because I think I have a way more intuitive sense of, do I want to roster Austin Eckler, or do I want 30% exposure to Jamar Chase if he's 15% owned than I do of Jamar Chase's average projection is 14.16 and it should be 15.5, right? My sense of DFS intuition comes from exposures, not from projections. However, I do think I gain a little bit of that intuition when I'm thinking about projections when I change the percentiles up to like 95th, because then you're looking at a ceiling and I can kind of ask myself, does that make sense? And I have a little bit more intuition there. The flip side of that, the one thing to be, and this will be the last thing I say on this before I move on, the one thing to be concerned is that's a very easy way to leak bias into your process, right? Like you could sit here all day and say, let's pick one where I have the benefit of hindsight. Leonard Fournette's not scoring 31.5 points on the Colts this week on the road, right? Well, you probably would have regretted that one. Like very easy to leak bias in here, So I like to use it as a little bit of an intuitive guidepost sometimes, but I would be careful using it too much. So anyway, but I'll leave it there. And we'll move on to the next question. And this is from Chris. And sorry, Chris, that you have been waiting for a little while. I've seen your question here. How far away from the default settings do you go in NBA? How much tweaking is too much? Great question. I don't tweak very much in NBA at all. If you are interested in watching someone that does have a little bit more of a hands-on approach to the NBA process, on our YouTube channel, under our NBA course, Max actually recently recorded a video. It's an hour long for a live NBA slate. Like this is his hour up until lock, doing all of his research and making adjustments to projections based on news breaking and rotations and things like that. Our projections will update when news breaks. If Jokic gets ruled out, we will adjust accordingly. But Max adds a lot of additional value, studying rotations and making tweaks and doing things like that here or there. I don't make a lot of adjustments to NBA, mostly because I think personally there's really one enormous edge in NBA, and especially on a 9-game slate, I fully expect to take advantage of it tonight, and that's late swap, right? I don't want to spend a ton of time dialing in exposures and projections and things like that for a bunch of different players and games on the slate, knowing that you're probably only going to get starting lineups for almost every single game here, like 15 minutes before the games start. And I generally end up making most of my money in NBA using very good projections to begin with, like we have at SaberSim here. And then just counting on the fact that the field's not going to swap accordingly to news as it breaks, right? I have recorded videos of my process on NFL and baseball where I talk about like research builds and making adjustments to exposures to get leverage on certain plays and things like that. And I think that's a good part of where I get some of my edge in those sports. But, for example, I could sit here and, tweak things and dial things in and determine that, okay, my stand I'm going to end up making on the slate is I'm going to fade. I'm going to be under on Dort and Wood and find some low-owned games playing in the Portland and Utah game, right? I'm just making stuff up. Inevitably, what's going to end up happening is someone's going to get ruled out after lock that changes the whole kind of context of the slate, right? Maybe guys like Dort and LeVert and PJ Washington and all these other guys are going to be very highly owned because there's not a lot of other value at the low end of the salary range tonight, right? But if all of a sudden you open up a bunch of value on the low end of the salary range because somebody else gets ruled out, then that whole kind of theory is blown up. So the point here, the broad point here is that I think, late swap is an edge in and of itself because the field, especially at lower stakes, doesn't swap enough. So you end up almost always being able to get some player that is suboptimally owned purely because he became a value after the slate locked. But secondly, because with my process of the way that I a lot of times think about DFS from a leverage standpoint and inefficient ownership and things like that, a lot of that stuff gets thrown out of the window as soon as you get some surprising news after lock anyway. So coming back to the question, I really don't change that much here from the defaults. And Matt said something recently like that too in the NBA Slack. I think at the start of the season, I think maybe there were a few rough slates right at the start of the season. Matt has even mentioned before that in NBA in particular, a lot of what he does is just, builds the lineups and then late swaps like religiously when news changes. And that's very similar to what my process overall looks like. But I think in general, if you are going to take the approach where you want to make a lot of adjustments, the best advice I can give is to watch Max's video and do something similar to what Max does. Because adjustments to exposures in step 3 are going to be pretty fragile in the face of late swap. Adjustments to projections are going to stand up pretty well, right? Like, let me put this another way. If you, again, have decided that you are taking a stand and going under on certain players from a leverage standpoint at lock, and things change in the slate because a player gets ruled out, you have to reevaluate whether or not that those plays are still good plays to be under on, which is kind of an evaluation. It's an analysis question that you have to deal with maybe with only 10 minutes before the next slate locks. If you are making adjustments to projections instead, then if is Luka playing? Then if Luka surprise gets scratched out of this Cavs Mavericks game an hour into the slate, you don't really need to worry about the custom projection edits you've made to the Washington and Spurs game because the builder will figure all of that out for you. But if you've set a minimum exposure to DeJounte Murray in this game, then suddenly you have to, this is the perfect example. Then you have to worry about that because that minimum exposure you set to DeJounte Murray might be getting you away from Jalen Brunson or Tim Hardaway, who's now become a really good play, right? That's kind of what I mean of how editing projections, I think, is a little bit safer. It's a little more anti-fragile when late swapping in NBA than editing exposures is. So, but I see some follow-up questions that are coming up here, so I'm going to hit these real quick. Chris says, can you late swap within SaberSim? You can. It is pretty cool. I guess I'll do a very quick demo of it here just to show you real quickly. And then also on this question too, so 400 Runner said, how long after news breaks does SaberSim update on average? Typically 1 to 2 minutes. A lot of times like 60 seconds or less for that news. We have a NBA lineup alerts channel set up in our Slack. First of all, there's a link to join our Slack community in the description of every past office hours video. So if you want to join Slack, you can join up, go check out that description of any old office hours video. But we have it set up for the Underdog NBA lineup alerts Twitter and also plugged into our sim alerts. And you'll see, news will break, something will change, player gets ruled out, and our sim typically starts running sometimes like just a couple seconds after that. And the sim finishes typically like a minute after that. So it's super fast. And then Chris, can you late swap within SaberSim? Yes, you can. So the way it works is you'll have your entries in, right? Maybe these are your entries here. And you go ahead and click swap and then late swap. You'll use the same build settings that you used for you can change them if you want, but typically you use the same build settings that you used for your initial build. So we'll value correlation and ownership and variance in the late swap process the same way we did when you built your original lineups. Just click late swap 20 lineups. Takes just a second to run. In this case, it's just rebuilding 20. I know it's a little confusing. It says 1,500 there, but it's just rebuilding 20. And then it's going to bring you to your new updated lineups. Just like that. And then you click download new entries, and that's your entries file, and you upload it to DraftKings. So super easy. And that's why I think there's such an edge, because everybody else is going to be fumbling around trying to get their projections to update, first of all, but then also to fix all their player groups that they had to go make and all their rules. And if you've ever used like a different tool around late swap, you're probably going to get some errors now because something's wrong. And, or you have to now, you had a rule that said don't use more than 3 players from the same team, but now Luka's out and you want 3 players from Dallas and you're scrambling for all this. You don't really have to do any of that here because it happens automatically for you. So. Question from the Goon here about, can you show how to adjust exposures again so you get balanced lineups, please? Yeah, sure. So if you take your build, one of the cool things about SaberSim here too, so I'll plug this as well, since I have a sense that we maybe have some new faces here, is that pre-build, right? So this is, a GPP build. We build extra lineups. So in this case, I asked for 20, but we built 1,500 lineups. Just took a couple seconds. And the reason for that is because now we can go ahead and make adjustments to our player exposures after building lineups without having to build more lineups. So a lot of times on other tool, your lineup building process looks something like put your projections in, make your adjustments to projections, put a bunch of rules in and things like that, and then press go and see what you get. And if you don't really like it or you want to make some tweaks, you got to go back to step 1, put new settings in, do it again. In this case, you don't have to, right? We can say we just built all of our lineups. We need 20 and we're feeling pretty happy with this overall, but I'm not really so sure that I want 85% of my night resting on the back of Nasir Little. Maybe I just want 30%. Boom. I make that adjustment here and we filter through the pool of 1,500 to find the best 20 where Nasir Little is only showing up in 30 maximum. So in this particular question from the Goon, it looks like he wants kind of a more balanced approach. So if you want a balanced approach, you can just kind of tamp down the maximum exposure of all the players that are showing up at the top of your pool. So maybe you set a maximum exposure of 50% to most of these guys at the top. And this would be kind of a low risk approach to player exposures, right? So there we go. So now we have 20 lineups where we don't have any player rostered more than 50% of the time. This would be kind of that balanced approach. Don't have to build any more lineups, anything like that. So pretty nifty. Cool. Sweet. Let me get to this next question here. This is from Freeman. This came in Slack. Let's hit this real quick. He said, how much should you pivot from the optimal lineup if you run a 3 crunch build to get an idea on what players to actually play or remove? I know ownership is important and may play a factor when pivoting to similar players at the same price on basketball. Yeah, I think that's a really good approach. I'll tell you, so when you start to get down to 3 lineups or even just 1 lineup, if you're a single entry player, a lot of times what I like to do is take a little bit more of a hand-picked approach. So let's do this build here first, right? So let's say we're playing a 3 max. You're probably playing, it's probably 1,000 to 10,000 people. I know there is the hot shot is one of my favorites. $3 3 entry max on DraftKings. Has like 4,000 entrants on an average night, right? So we can go ahead and build lineups for that contest. And what I was saying here before, when you start to get down to like 3 lineups, 5 lineups, 1 lineup, I think exposures start to mean a little bit less, right? Like it's not as helpful saying I'm 66.7% exposed to Karis LeVert when you're only building 3 lineups, because you can only be what, 4 different, you can only have 4 different exposures to any one player. Whereas we have 20 different exposures that we could potentially be to a player in a 20 max, right? So I think when you are looking for your lineups when you're building like 3 entry max lineups, one of my favorite things to do is to like kind of have more of a hand-picked approach. So we're going to pick our top 3 lineups by Saber score and give these to you to start with. But the Saber score of all these top lineups is going to be pretty approximately similar. Even if we come down all the way to like the, 40th, 50th best lineup, we're talking about lineups that are a Saber score of just 2.5 points off of the top overall lineup, right? there's not a big functional difference between these lineups. So I think there's a lot of different ways you can do this. I think you can come at it from looking at the standpoint of ownership sum and see if you can find some lineups that are maybe a little bit under less owned overall, but have a similar overall Saber score and projected score, and kind of click some of these in, right? I think that can be a really good approach. You can do some additional research and just look for a particular player, right? Maybe you think that, let's see if we can find someone interesting here. Let's look at value as well. Maybe you think that a guy like Jimmy Butler's going under-owned or you think he's likely to go under-owned because he is going to be questionable going into lock, or maybe he is questionable going into lock. The Heat say he's a legitimate game time decision, and you know you can late swap if you need to. So you go ahead and intentionally pick in at least a couple Jimmy Butler lineups to play, right? Maybe just one, right? There can be a lot of different ways to do this. So I think when you're playing like a 3-entry max or a single entry or 5 entries or less or something like that, I think it's totally fine to take kind of more of an approach of hand picking. If you want to use ownership as your guidepost and hand pick lineups that are a little bit less total owned or anything like that, I think that's great. If you just want to use the 3 best lineups that we give you, I think that's also totally fine, because it's not as if these are just the 3 highest projected lineups, right? They are lineups that have been built with a care to upside and ownership already, right? It's important to remember that. So ownership for a 3-entry max of this size is low, but it has already been taken into account to the extent that we think is appropriate for this size contest. So I think it's also totally fine if you want to just take our top 3 favorite lineups. But the broad overall point here is that when you go in and you build your lineups for a particular contest size, and you go in and set your sliders, whether it's a 3-entry max or a single entry or a 150 max, you should treat the pool of lineups we build for you as roughly a pool of lineups that are all viable for the contest. And if you say that you go into the 3-entry max and your favorite 3 to play are 1, 2, and 3, then great. If your favorite 3 to play are 89, 91, and 117, great. They're all probably going to be roughly, they are going, let me put it this way, they are going to have a slim enough difference in expected value that if you have a sense of why one lineup might be better than the other, you should trust it, because they're all going to be good. So Ryan said that ownership on KPJ seems low. Yeah, it probably is. It's early in the day, and at this point, our projections are going to update faster than our ownership projections. So I would say, like, I'm sure it will update later throughout the day. If it does not, and you think that it is low as we approach lock, I would increase it. The very first question that I actually tackled on stream here today, after we did our giveaway stuff at the start of the stream and things like that, was about ownership. I did kind of a quick discussion on how our ownership projections are calculated, and some of the limitations of our ownership projection model. So I checked that out too, but I would feel pretty confident that that is likely to update as the day goes on. So 400 runner says, if you're making an adjustment, does it matter more if you adjust projections or ownership? Does one affect the build more than the others? Neither necessarily affects the build more than others. They affect it a little bit differently. Changing a player's ownership has just a very, intuitive effect, right? The player's new ownership projection, when we then calculate the ownership fade, is what you have changed it to. So let's use the Kevin Porter example, right? So right now, when you build lineups, we compare a player's ownership projection to the average ownership projection at the player's position and make an adjustment to that player's projection that they score in their individual bucket of game simulations that's going into that particular lineup, based on whether or not we think they are a lower or higher than average owned play. So if you adjust Kevin Porter, for example, to 35% or something like that, right? Whereas at 4.6% owned, he probably would be considered a low owned play. Now he's going to be considered a high owned play. And if we use him in a lineup, it will be in spite of the fact that he is owned highly. If he is 4.6% projected owned, he might be used in a lineup even if he wasn't projected well because he was so low owned, right? So the ownership projection kind of just has the effect that you would expect. Changing a player's projection is actually a little bit different. And what happens here is if we think that Kevin Porter Jr. is also under projected and we change his projection to 38.44. Let's keep that too, right? We've increased his projection by 2 points. What happens here is we will actually take every single game simulation we have of the Rockets Thunder game. And in every single game sim outcome, we will increase Kevin Porter Jr.'s scoring output in that particular sim by the difference of our projection and your custom projection at the average. So in this case, 2 points. It has the effect of moving his entire range of outcomes 2 points to the right. So then when we use sim variance to build your lineups, right? What sim variance does is at higher values, we use smaller buckets of random game simulations to determine the projections for each player when we build every single lineup. So the impact of this is that when sim variance goes in and buckets the game simulations and starts building lineups, it will use the game simulations that have been updated and moved all 2 points up. Ultimately, changing a player's, especially if you are making an adjustment to a player with the intention of trying to get something to happen, updating their projection is going to have a bigger impact, probably, especially in a sport like basketball. Like if you want more of Kevin Porter Jr., it makes sense. The easiest way to getting that is to bump up his projection. So in NBA, even making changes to ownership projection, even significant changes to ownership projection, will have less of an impact than I think people think for two reasons. One, because the ownership fade slider is generally pretty low. In our back testing, we find that aggressive fades of ownership in a sport like NBA is not a way to build higher expected value lineups. But two, the best overall projected plays on the slate typically have a very small chance of failing for their particular salary because they're normally distributed, right? We look at a guy like Nasir Little, 7.41 projected points per dollar on average. You think for him to pay off his salary, probably needs 6x, something like that, approximately, which would be, let's just approximate like 18 or 20 points. And we can see, if we look at like 20 points, for example, just how many of his game simulations he exceeds that point value, right? Even at a very high ownership projection, it's going to make a lot of sense to have some exposure to somebody like Nasir Little. Chris said, does the sim revert to my own by default? Yeah, this comes up a lot too as well. The value in the my proj column or the my own column is always what is used when building lineups, whether you've changed it or not. The SS proj and the SS own are really just for reference, but we never use those columns when building lineups. It is always what is in my proj and my own. So. Epic Problem here asked, has there been any other thought on a podcast feed for the stream audio? Yeah, no, it's on my radar. It's something I want to do. I've been busy with all the other stuff we have going on the content side here. Most importantly, a lot of updates to the actual YouTube channel. So the YouTube channel has gotten a little bit of a facelift here, and more is planned here. We'll be continuing to make the YouTube channel better and better here. I do want to get a podcast feed set up, but I would say we will probably come after getting the YouTube channel totally where we want it to be. So it's on our radar, but yeah. So okay. Well, I think I'm going to leave it right there. It's been another awesome stream. We're right at about the 1 hour and 23 minute mark, which is awesome. Had a good stream today. Had all kinds of stuff going on. We did our weekly max challenge winners and giveaway winners. We've talked a lot about making adjustments to exposures, the effect of changing projection and ownership on the sims, talked about some entry editor and late swap stuff. We talked about percentiles, really interesting conversation on percentiles, all kinds of stuff. So I know It sounds like a few of you guys here are maybe tuning in for the first time or haven't really had an opportunity to check out SaberSim yet before. So if that is the case, we offer a totally no strings attached, legitimately free 7-day trial for our product. So you can sign up today, get a free 7 days, check us out all week for NBA, NHL if you want to, football tonight, Thursday, Sunday. And if you hate it, hopefully you don't, but if you hate it, you can cancel and we'll never charge you a dime. So $7, no strings attached. Not $7, 7 days, no strings attached. Just go to SaberSim.com, start my free trial, and get all signed up there. I also host this stream every single weekday, Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. So if you go on to our YouTube channel, click the subscribe. And I guess I should actually do this too. Boom. I don't even have notifications turned on. Click the notifications bell. You'll get a notification every time I go live for one of these office hours streams. Happy to answer any questions you have. Whether you've been using SaberSim, you can ask anybody here watching whether you've been using SaberSim for years, playing DFS for years. Happy to talk about more kind of advanced stuff. If you are on your first day of SaberSim, and maybe you've been using a different tool for years and you know all the ins and out of a different tool, but using SaberSim for the first time and you're confused, happy to talk about that. If you're playing DFS for the very first time, right? We've had people come in here that are just learning DFS and have questions like that. I'm happy to talk about whatever you guys want to talk about. That is what I am here for. So definitely recommend checking us out, tuning back in for the streams for the rest of the week. Until then, for everybody else here, I will be back right here again, same time, same place tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. Enjoy the 9-game NBA slate tonight. Enjoy NFL Showdown. If you're playing NFL Showdown, we didn't really talk NFL at all today, or at least Showdown today, which is kind of unique for a Monday, but and enjoy the 4-game NHL slate if you're playing a little hockey DFS. So last question. We'll do this. I'll hit this one on a quick fadeaway from Jeff. How many lineups can you generate in the trial? Is there a limit? There's no limit to how many lineups you can build. If you want to sit here and build lineups all 7 days, 24 hours, you can build lineups to your heart's content. There are 2 different plans. I will say this. We have 2 different plans. There is what we call the starter and what we call the advanced. $49.99 for the starter, $89.99 for the advanced. And then the main difference between these two, or there's 2 main differences. The advanced plan, if you want to upload or download projections, you need to be on the advanced plan. And you are also limited on the starter plan to only building 20. You can only build 20 lineups at a time, or you can only build for 20. So more specifically, what it will look like is that you cannot have more than 20 number of lineups here, and your pool size cannot be greater than 500 here. So if you want to build for 150 maxes, or if you want to do more crazy stuff with big 1500 pool lineups and things like that, you need to be on the advanced plan. But easiest thing to do is sign up for the trial on the advanced plan. Check out the best version of the product on the advanced plan. And if you don't like it, you can cancel. Or if you are on the advanced plan and you think, I only play 20 maxes and I'm never going to download projections or upload custom projections or anything like that, at the end of the trial, just email us, support@sabersim.com, and we'll get you onto the starter plan instead. So Jeff says, can you use a phone or an iPad? Yes, you can. Totally mobile optimized. I'll show you quickly kind of what it looks like. But the app works great mobile. We actually did a big update here in late summer, early fall. Big redesign to the entire app to make everything very mobile friendly. So everything is nice and mobile friendly now. So, yeah, again, free 7 days, go check it out. And we'll go from there. So thank you again, guys, everybody that tuned in. I will be back here again tomorrow. Until then, good luck tonight and see ya.